Yo, what's going on, YouTube, and welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It's your boy Kevin Forte, and we are taking a look today at the latest on the Vancouver Canucks. As there's some big news for this team coming up, a lot of rumors being thrown out there. Ever since the trade deadline, there was a lot of talk about JT Miller. That quickly fizzled out when they kind of didn't see the market they wanted for him. Brock Besser is a restricted free agent this summer. His contract does end at the end of this season. And as JT Miller's going into a contract for next year, he's going into the final year of his deal next year. What are things looking like there? So we're going to go over both of those today. So we got some updates since the trade deadline. Obviously, both these players are still on the Canucks. Now, you may be wondering to yourself, well, why would they want to trade these two players? For similar but also very different reasons. So JT Miller, the perspective on JT Miller is there was some thought process from Patrick Allvin and Jim Rutherford that maybe the Vancouver Canucks would move on from JT Miller. And you may be wondering to yourself, well, why would you do that? I mean, there was consideration at the beginning of this season, he could potentially win the Hart Trophy. He has just been that dominant for the Vancouver Canucks. And that's kind of fizzled out just a little bit as the season's gone along, but people still really like JT Miller. He's been an alternate captain in Vancouver this season. He's one of those guys that's just a really good player. There was some discrepancy in terms of maybe JT Miller being a divide, creating some division in the locker room between the vets and the young guys. But we really haven't heard much in that regard, really probably since January, February was when that was talked about. And now we're starting to hear about, well, why would they want to trade JT Miller in the first place, right? Well, you have to look at it as his value is super high, right? I mean, his value was extremely high. Hart Trophy Hart Trophy candidate, probably. Maybe not so much now, but maybe, right? Obviously, players have kind of leapfrogged him in that regard. McDavid, Matthews, you could make a pretty good list other than JT Miller at this point. But a year from free agency, you have this year's playoffs and next year's playoffs, which means the value for JT Miller is way, way more in terms of what the Vancouver Canucks could get for him if they did decide to trade him. And we've seen a lot of teams do that. I mean, you look at what the Montreal Canadiens did for Artturi Lehkonen. His contract ends next year, but the Colorado Avalanche, Joe Sakic, said, listen, we were not giving up a guy like Justin Barron if he didn't have another year on his contract. A lot of guys, we've seen that from Tampa as well, giving up multiple first-round picks for a guy like Brandon Hagel because of the contract and the duration of that contract, not just the player itself. So that's kind of what you'd be looking at with Miller. The value is going to be much higher in the 2022 trade deadline than the 2023 trade deadline, where he has more than a year left of his contract. And, this year, next year, he will be a pure rental for a team who is trying to get a dozen regular season games with him and a good playoff run out of him. The value is going to be very, very different. So we've been hearing that the Canucks are probably more leaning toward the side of re-signing JT Miller. That's kind of been the assumption, and that's why he didn't get traded ultimately at the trade deadline. And obviously the factor that maybe they weren't getting the value that they wanted to get for JT Miller. So they said, the value we want to trade JT Miller for a certain price. Nobody's offering that price, so we're just going to keep him. And that's kind of what's nice that you could figure out a year away is if we really want to keep this guy, we should really consider starting to lay the footprint of a contract. And this is what we're hearing from Elliot Friedman. The next contract for JT Miller is going to be in the Mika Zibanejad area of $8.5 million per season. Like I said, Mika Zibanejad was supposed to be an unrestricted free agent this summer for the New York Rangers. The Rangers locked him up in training camp, and they signed him to that long-term contract. Nobody's really talking about that now because he is a member of the New York Rangers. But Mika Zibanejad, looking at his contract, we're going to get the details here. Let me pull it up for you. So he signed an 8-year contract, $8.5 million per season. He also has a no movement clause attached to that. And then starting in 2029-2030, the final year of that contract, 7 days prior to the trade deadline, the no move clause turns into a modified no trade clause with a 21-team no trade list. So basically, that is sort of, if you look at Claude Giroux, with the Philadelphia Flyers, how the Flyers had no leverage in their deal for Giroux because Giroux had full autonomy on where he was going to go. Now, the thing is, in 2030, which, I mean, that's a decade from now, when the Flyers try to move that, well, the Rangers try to move that contract, a 21-team, what is that? 21-team no-trade list. So there will be, depending on how many teams are in the NHL in the next decade, we could see another 1 or 2 teams by that point. That's kind of semantics at this point, but let's say there's a dozen teams, right? At this point, there will be a dozen teams that Mika Zibanejad would have no control over the New York Rangers trading his contract to. If that's all it is at that point, right? We're assuming that at this point because that's a pretty damn long time away from now. But that's kind of what you're looking at. It's maybe going to be a way for them to trade him easier as a rental in that final year of his contract. Because that's really what you're looking at. I really don't see that, he's going to have stability. He's going to be a New York Ranger for the next 8 years at this point. Unless things go extremely bad and again, that could happen. Absolutely. But you're looking at a guy that's 28 years old. He'll be 37, around the age of Claude Giroux. You're going to be looking at that scenario where it would be easier for the Rangers if they wanted to trade Mika Zibanejad. They could have that ability in 8 years from now or 9 years from now, whatever you want to call it, right? So that's kind of what you're looking at there. And that's kind of the comparable that's been brought up for JT Miller, of course, a former New York Ranger. So that's the latest on JT Miller. So it looks more likely than not he will stay in Vancouver. And I think that's a good move by the Canucks. JT Miller's been a great fit there. He's been kind of bouncing around recently. He was with the Rangers, then he was with Tampa. And there was a lot of, Jim Benning took a lot of flack for giving up a first-round pick for Miller, kind of shedding some salary off of Tampa Bay's roster. Honestly, I would say that's probably an underpayment. Looking back now, that was one of the best Jim Benning trades I think he ever had in his tenure as a GM of the Canucks. Kind of interesting how things kind of come full circle in that regard, right? So now the next guy we have to talk about is Brock Besser. Now this one is a lot different because we're looking at Brock Besser in terms of a guy that's a restricted free agent this summer. Now, the Vancouver Canucks did not sign him before the trade deadline, and there's no real assumption that until the end of the regular season that there will be a contract for Brock Besser. Now, the thing we have to look at here is, what is Brock Besser's situation? Is this a guy that's going to be eligible for an offer sheet? And that's the kind of thing you have to look at now going into the offseason if you're the Canucks, because that's really the only leverage that Besser would have in a contract discussion this summer. So let's take a look here. Let's see what we've got. So Brock Besser. Let's see, where is he? Okay. Yeah, so like I said, final year of his contract. He signed a 3-year deal back in 2019, September of 2019. He signed a 3-year deal with the Canucks. Just a shade under $6 million per season, so 5.875. And he's taken up 7% of the cap. So if you're looking at what we could be looking at this year, let's see. I'm trying to find if there's anything here that can show me what kind of contract he's going to have. So let's see. So he is arbitration eligible. So he does meet the requirements of games played. So that's something to consider. He spent 5 seasons in the NHL. So he has met the games required for arbitration. So that is something to look at. And that's something that Brock Besser, who is 25 years old, the only real critique of Besser is really not even as much this year, but in recent history here through the COVID times, non-COVID related injuries for Brock Besser. He's been injured a lot, and his prolific goal scoring that he had in his rookie season and, really since then, even in his rookie season, probably the reason he couldn't compete as much with Barzal in 2018 for the Calder Trophy was because he missed the last leg of the regular season because he was injured. So this has been a theme for Brock Besser ever since his rookie campaign with the Canucks. And you wonder if you're the Canucks, 25-year-old kid, he's probably going to want a 6 or 7, maybe even that 8-year ticket. That'll take him till he's 32, 33 years old, and he could probably cash in another bag before the end of his NHL career. So you're looking at a situation where maybe he wants a 5 or 6 year deal. Take him till he's 30, and then he could take the 7 or 8 year deal when he's 30, 31, and then he could get all the cash and prizes one more time before this is all said and done for Brock Besser. So you're looking at something here where if the Canucks are truly invested in Brock Besser, which I think there's reason to say that they maybe aren't. I mean, you look at this team around him. You have Elias Pettersson, Bo Horvat. JT Miller has to get re-signed. You already have Connor Garland on a 5-year deal. There's been some talk maybe that they trade him. Vasily Podkolzin, who's coming in, he's still on the first year of his entry-level contract. So after this season, you have 2 more years on his ELC. He could take Brock Besser's spot in the top 6 as a winger. Just, again, if you're looking to save salary, and that's kind of what you're looking at, really, at this point. And then you look at some of the younger guys. What do we got here? We have really nothing that enticing, like forward-wise, and even defensively. But you get what I'm saying here. I mean, the only real contract you have to re-sign now is JT Miller, Brock Besser. Elias Pettersson is 3 years from a new contract. So you don't really have to worry about that. And you do have Bo Horvat. So like the Canucks are going to have to decide. They're not going to be able to keep everybody. And I think Brock Besser could be the odd man out. Now, looking at this report here from Patrick Johnston, so far there has been no progress in contract talks between the Canucks and Brock Besser. So that's a little bit interesting because now we're looking at a spot here where Brock Besser is kind of in nowhere land. Like, do the Canucks decide to trade him, like his rights this summer? Do they do like a sign-in trade? What is sort of the scenario here? Because with a guy like Brock Besser, again, this is a guy that was very highly sought of, highly coveted, especially in his 2018, his first season with the Canucks. This was a guy that was a true wrecking ball in his first season. Even in the final year of his, once he ended his season in North Dakota, he played a dozen games at the tail end of his first season with the Canucks and did really well and helped them in the playoffs. Like, again, Brock Besser does have a pedigree here in Vancouver. He's been there for 4 or 5 years now. So it kind of makes you wonder, where is the Canucks mindset? Because you look at other wingers, I mean, other than Podkolzin, you've got Horvat, you've got Pettersson, you've got Miller, who really, for all intents and purposes, had been playing wing but can play center. It kind of leaves you wondering, what is the depth? Like, the Canucks can only invest so much depth, and unless they move out Connor Garland contracts, Tyler Myers contracts, you're not going to be able to re-sign Brock Besser. And I think that's why a lot of talk was on the Canucks trying to move some of those bigger ticket contracts, because it doesn't make room to keep a guy like Brock Besser. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. What do you think of the Vancouver Canucks here? I think this is going to be an extremely interesting summer in Vancouver. So like I said, the new management team, Patrick Allvin and Jim Rutherford, they're going to be trying to get their their fingerprints all over this team in their first big summer with the team. They can make a big splash with their new organization, kind of set the tone for what the future of this franchise will be. So we'll kind of have to wait and see what happens, but let me know what you guys think. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.